Okay, so I'm really happy to introduce today's speaker, Carl Rasmussen, who is a professor of machine learning in the engineering department. He heads the computational and biological learning lab and the machine learning group in the department. And he's also chief scientist at a startup called Crawler, an AI company. He was a research scientist at the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen, and he got his PhD from the University of Toronto under the supervision of Jeff Hinton, one of the gods of machine learning, a direct descendant from God. He's been working on probabilistic inference and decision making, and more recently, quite a few ideas about how to combat climate change. And I think today we're going to hear about his latest thoughts on how to do that. So thanks very much for joining us. Looking forward to it. It's all yours.
Thanks, Keshav. Thanks for coming. I usually work on stochastic processes and learning, but I've also recently become more interested in questions in climate change. And the thought that I'm going to talk to you about today sort of started, I think, about a year ago, where I went to a meeting where we were talking about it's a roundtable discussion and a discussion about the Paris Agreement, and it ended up being that the discussion went around the table and people saying, well, what do they think about the Paris Agreement? And I was absolutely shocked to hear that almost everybody in the room thought that the Paris Agreement was a pretty good agreement. Maybe it wasn't working quite as fast as we might hope. Whereas I think it's a disaster of an agreement. So I'm going to try to explain to you why I think it's a disaster. I think it's a worse than nothing agreement, and I'll try to explain to you why I think that's the case. And I think it's very important because I think we're as an international community, we're putting a lot of efforts into try to make the Paris Agreement work, and I think it fundamentally will not work. And the more quickly we realize that, the better. I'm happy taking questions as we go along. I've only got a few slides, and hopefully we can get into a meaty discussion as we go along. So please interrupt. I'll tell you if you're interrupting too much. It's unlikely to happen.
Do you want to try to get rid of that Zoom thing? Is that...
Yeah, how do I do that?
Just click the minimize button. That's fine.
Okay, so the heart of the matter, right? So our climate system responds to our collective actions, but individual nations have their isolated short-term incentives favor fossil fuels, right? If that was not the case, then we wouldn't really have a problem, right? But unfortunately, the global and the collective incentives are necessary to avoid the serious effects that climate change will have, right? So there's a tension between these two things. There's what we would want to do in a completely selfish short-term desires, and what we should do as a community, right? So I think global cooperation is really the name of the game. We need global cooperation to align the objectives that individual countries see with the international or the global incentives. Now here, I'm focusing on countries. Later on, I'll be putting more emphasis on why I think countries is kind of the right level to think about. But this holds all the way through the hierarchy, right? It will also hold for company, like what's the company doing, or what's the community doing, or what are individuals doing, and again, it comes down to this trade-off. And I think so my talk is really about the mechanisms that we can use to address this, or the framework that can be used to address this with this basic tension. And I think if we don't address that tension, then I think all our efforts will probably not quite make it, right? So to my mind, the problem that we're looking at is one of how do we cooperate globally. So I'm going to talk about three things essentially. So I'm going to talk about international cooperation. What does it mean and when does it work? Then I'll talk a little bit about where we are now talk about, particularly the Paris Agreement. I'm well aware that there are lots of other initiatives. I'm using the Paris Agreement as an example of the primary international vehicle that we have at the moment. And then I'm going to talk about a constructive alternative. So I'm going to criticize the Paris Agreement, and I'm going to tell you about a scheme that doesn't have these deficits that we could pursue instead. And I'm going to come up with a very concrete proposal. I'm not actually wedded to all the details, but instead of talking about it in the abstract, I think it's much easier just to talk about it very, very concretely. But we can talk about the details. I'm not completely wed to anything. All right, so now the big question is, why would you cooperate, right? And of course, if you have an international cooperation, then this has to be between free sovereign countries. Right? You can't force a country to do anything that they don't want to do, right? And so the question is, why would you voluntarily join this kind of effort? So the upside here, successful cooperation means that we can all pay a small cost, but avoid a much larger cost associated with unchecked climate change, right? And that is kind of the carrot here. If we allow ourselves to go for the short term nice things that would be good in the short term and good locally, then well, that would save us a little bit of effort in the immediate term, but it could be vastly the cost could be vastly higher in the slightly longer term, right? So there's nothing in the mechanism that says that this small cost that we can save, that we can somehow, that how it relates to the larger cost. And conversely, failure to cooperate means that everybody might pay a cost that far exceeds the small benefits they had from not cooperating. Now, the difficulty here is, of course, that you could have free riders, you could have people who sit on the sideline and say, well, sorry, we're not going to participate, but if you fix the environment, it's also going to be good for us, right? And so there'll have to be some sort of mechanism to avoid that large parts of the world decide to take this on. So first of all, a warning that so something you hear a lot in the media is people who argue that my country is only responsible for 1% of emissions, so it's essentially irrelevant what we do, right? And this completely misses the point of what you can achieve through cooperation, right? And of course, this argument I could use this argument to not pay income tax, for example. My income tax is way smaller than 1%, right? But I hope you can see that this is not really a coherent argument. But surprisingly, you hear this or variants of this thing quite a lot. Right? So we're talking here about what are the benefits of real cooperation. Did you have a question?
I am going to interrupt. So I think that bottom thing is, it is sometimes said, but I think often what's said is it's more about like the quote unquote just transition. That's sort of like my country is only responsible for 1% of emissions, and we have not historically been able to benefit from like the industrial growth that other countries want to do at our expense. Therefore, it's irrelevant what we do, but I should be able to do something different than what other countries are doing in reducing fossil fuels faster, more aggressively through different means. Do you think that inference is okay and is part of this cooperative agreement, or?
Yeah, I think obviously you have to have a just system. Otherwise, you're not going to buy into it, right? Do I think that we can create the thing? Well, I think certainly there's a lot of potential there, right? Because not doing it would have such bad consequences that there's a lot of leeway that you could sort of hand out to different groups, right? But part of the problem is, of course, that at the moment, the way that the natural resources are being used is very unjust if you look across the world. Right? So I would definitely say that you could make that argument, right? But British politicians also make this argument, right? I think maybe it's not well warranted in that case.
I mean, but we just carry that on. Let's take, this argument is leaning on the fact that some countries responsible for, let's say, 10% or emissions. So if you're in the Maldives and you say, okay, I'm emitting 0.001%, and China is emitting 10%, even if I do the best possible thing in the world, it's not going to make any difference compared to what the Chinese premier can do. So why should I reduce my standard of living, whatever it is? Even if I'm going to get wiped out in 20 years because of all these, because what really matters is to use my influence to influence to how the big countries do their job.
Yeah, so I think, I don't know about the being wiped out in 20 years. I mean, I think that certainly adds something to the equation, but you know, do you think income tax is a good idea? Right? You pay like a very small percentage of your money, and it'd be better for you if you didn't pay income tax.
But that's a false analogy because I get services from income tax. For my income tax, I get roads, I get defense, I get postal, whatever, I get a bunch of services that are accruing to me from my participation in the income tax. Whereas if I have a very small contribution to the climate, carbon dioxide, and the services or disservices are shared equally, independent of my actions, then there's a decoupling of my action from outcomes.
Good point. So I'm going to talk about how do we share the resources in a just way, right? And so pull me up on not having addressed that if I haven't. Okay, so now the question is, when does cooperation work? And that's actually a very nice book here by Elinor Ostrom, which I very much recommend. It's a very short book. It's very readable. She's an economist, maybe not a mainstream economist. I don't really understand what economists write, but I do understand what she writes. She got the Nobel. It's not the Nobel Prize. It's Nobel.
It's Nobel Prize in economics.
In economics, for this work, and she basically went out and looked at different places in the world where cooperation actually works, and she looked at what are the communities doing to make that happen. And there's a list of things that are sort of freely quoted from the book of what are the things that are necessary for cooperation to be able to work. Obviously, the participants have to share objectives. They're not trying to get to do the same thing. They're necessarily equal to cooperate about. Then there's commitment. So there has to be a firm commitment from the different players that they will actually participate in the process. There has to be mutual trust. You can't have a cooperative system with people if you don't trust that they do what they say they will do. There has to be transparency. You have to be able to check whether people are actually doing what they said they would be doing. You can also talk about methods of enforcement of what happens if a certain player in the cooperative doesn't do what they're supposed to do. What can the other participants what can they do about this sort of thing? And there's reciprocity. So there's a very strong natural feeling that people will have to say, well, I'm willing to do things if you're also willing to do them, right? I will pay my income taxes if my neighbor also pays their income taxes, right? If they don't pay, then it's not so much about whether the absolute tax pressure is a little bit higher or a little bit lower, but it has to be just between people in the community, right? So if you don't like reading books, there's a two-page article in Nature here by David Mackay and a couple of people, Price of Carbon, I Will If You Will, using the whole notion that you will be willing to do things if other partners are also willing to do things. So essentially, this is a very strong motivating factor in trying to set up these cooperatives. Okay, so these are not surprising. These are things, but there's actually a lot of detailed work on exactly to which extent you need these things. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at what properties do the Paris Agreement have, and how do they fit into these headings, right? And what I'm going to conclude is that there's nothing there. Right? It's just doing everything absolutely wrong. Okay, so aren't we already cooperating? So the Paris Agreement has been ineffectual so far, and it's going to fail. Let me just try to corroborate that I mean something very specific about those statements going to fail. It's not going to prevent us from hitting 1.5 degrees. And I don't think it's going to prevent us from hitting 2 degrees either. And it hasn't had any effect, had much effect so far. So here I plotted the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere on this scale over here. So the amount of CO2 over the last I think 64 years or so. The data set is from Mauna Loa. And you can see there's a seasonal fluctuation, and then there's a growth that's grown from 310 to about 420 now. And down here on the other axis, I'm plotting the slope of the curve. Right, so the slope of the curve, and I'm averaging the slope within different time windows. You have to do that because it's based on discrete data here. And in blue, I've shown you the yearly average, in red, the 3-year yearly average, and in gray, the 10-year average. And what you can see is that the growth rate on this axis, the growth rate keeps increasing, and it has reached now 2.5 parts per million per year. Right? And if we go back and say, okay, the Paris Agreement started in 2015, and since then, it's been at best growth as usual, which is the highest that has ever been. If anything, it's maybe increased a little bit since then. And of course, the growth rate has to go to 0 to prevent global warming. Okay, that's not happening. Okay, here's another graph showing the relationship between the amount of the data that I showed before. This is the Mauna Loa data again. Now just yearly averages against the global land ocean temperature relative to this 1850 to 1900, and I just plotted the last 65 years of data, which is what we have available from Mauna Loa. And you can see that this is actually astonishingly close to a straight line. Right? There's a whole debate at the moment about whether global warming the rate of global warming is increasing or not. I think if you plot the causally related variables, it's the CO2 which is causing the temperature, but then you get actually a very close to straight line. Of course, the data points are denser down here because heating happened slowly. And you can also see from this graph that if you extrapolate it by a modest amount, you see that in 450 parts per million, you reach the 1.5 degrees, right? And you would need something pretty drastically to change for this not to hold, at least in my view. So an interesting thing about this graph is, of course, the slope of the graph. And the slope of the graph shows that you get 0.1 degrees temperature every 10 parts per million, right? So that's every 4 years, because the CO2 is increasing by 2.5 parts per million per year. Yeah.
So even though it's increasing, I imagine that if policies were put in place, there could be a bit of a lag between that. So even though it is still increasing, has the Paris Agreement made any policy change? What's the policy changes been since the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, so I'm not saying that the Paris Agreement hasn't changed anything at all, and it might be that there has been some change in the policy that have slowed down the change by a little bit, but it's certainly nowhere near enough to achieve the goals that were set out.
But surely even a little bit of change is better than nothing.
Yes, but we need like the objective is to avoid that it changes by more than 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. I totally agree with you that these are somewhat arbitrary numbers, right? And 1.5 is better than 2, but 2 is better than 2.5, and 2.5 is better than 3. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Has it helped a little bit? Maybe, but let's go back to exactly what the policies are and why there's difficulty in actually making the policies happen under the agreement. Okay, did I finish talking about this thing? Yeah, so the temperature is going up by about a 10th of a degree every 4 years at the moment, if this holds up. Right? Of course, there's no real reason to believe that this should be a straight line fit. I was actually somewhat surprised that it's such a nice fit. Like there's time delays in there. There are other greenhouse gases that haven't even plotted here. There are other weather phenomena that influence the temperature, etc., etc. Nevertheless, the standard deviation of the fit here is less than a tenth of a degree. Right? It's a pretty strong fit. I mean, this is a completely trivial model. I haven't tried to refine it anyway.
But this is the best case because there could be nonlinear effects as the concentrations increase beyond certain thresholds.
There could be nonlinear effects. You know, if I look at this, I would say I can't see anything. Right. Yeah. Okay. So last year was very warm, right? But 2016 was maybe warm to a similar extent, and you know, afterwards, yeah, I'm not convinced. That's yeah. All right. Okay, so that's what I mean by you know, that the Paris Agreement failed, right? Okay, so let's look at some of the reasons, right? So firstly, there's a lack of binding commitments, right? So okay, the Paris Agreement is legally binding, but the parts of the agreement that are legally binding are not really the interesting parts, right? So the commitments that countries make, they are not part of the agreement, they are part of annexes to the agreement, and they're not legally binding. Right. So this is kind of a fudge, the real thing that's important here is not legally binding. Also, there are no meaningful. So you are bound to do something. So you have to report, for example, which I think is a good thing, right? But in terms of reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, this is not really it. Okay, so yeah, I think there are no meaningful duties or responsibilities. But you can basically do continue doing whatever they want. And as you probably all know, if you want to organize something or make something happen, you have to have duties and responsibilities. Otherwise, you know, things don't work. There's a singular focus on the temperature proxy, and so first of all, temperature is a proxy for what we want to achieve. Right? We want to make sure that living conditions on Earth are adequate. Right? It doesn't really matter what the temperature is, but the temperature is very strongly correlated to that. Right? And temperature is something that we measure, but we can't really measure living conditions. It's very hard to have an index of living conditions. Right? So temperature is a proxy, but I think it's a really bad proxy. Before I said that you can measure temperature, actually measuring the globe's temperature is pretty hard. And the way it's measured is a very, very complicated system of lots and lots of sensors and trying to calibrate these over time and space, etc. And we're not really interested in temperature in a particular year, right? So when meteorologists talk about temperature, they usually talk about the 20-year average of the temperature, right? Which means that you can only really measure it 10 years after it's happened, right? Because otherwise you can't calculate the average. So a temperature proxy here is a pretty bad choice. Like, it would be way better to choose the amount of CO2. It's really easy to measure, and it's very closely related to both the things that we care about, which is the living conditions, and actions that people take. The problem with temperature is it's very difficult to connect it to connect actions that people take to what the impact is on living conditions, right? So we could have just chosen things that were way better.
Just on that point,
yeah.
Do you think maybe the temperature measure was chosen as a sort of scientific communication tool for the general public? So the average person can understand a degree, 2 degrees increase in temperature, but talk about parts per million like using.
Well, I don't know. So I've kind of been thinking about this. I think the temperature was chosen so that nobody would be held responsible. Right? If we had chosen CO2, then we say, oh, hang on a minute. This country had emitted this much CO2, and they only have this small percentage of the population. This is like clearly not a satisfactory condition, right? At the moment, it's just related to temperature, and everybody says, well, we committed to temperature, and then you just look at the other guys in the room, right? And so because the weak relationship between our actions and temperature, I think it's a very convenient choice And so I'm being a bit cynical, but actually, that's what I believe.
I wonder if, like, temperature even is more communicable, because really it's like, it's a global mean surface temperature, which requires assumptions to even build that from like the sparse sensors that you have, and then you're comparing it to whatever, the 1850 to 1900 baseline. I mean, maybe just the idea of temperature is more communicable, but when you start getting into the calculation, it feels like it's even more complicated than that.
I totally agree with that, and also 1 degree Celsius sounds like nothing, right? So it puts a lot of people off. They say, what the hell are you going on about? Like yesterday, it was 5 degrees colder than today, you know. So I think, I don't think it's an easy thing to communicate. It's very counterintuitive in a way, and it's actually very difficult to measure, and it's very difficult to measure in a tiny amount, right? It's hardly even defined in a tiny amount, right? It's not really defined as long-term average. We don't have much time, and so that's a big problem, right?
What confuses me though is that the last successful protocol was Montreal protocol for ozone, and we did measure Dobson units. Had to look it up. There was a direct proxy to the thing that we were trying to reduce, and we seem to have explicitly departed from that for no kind of reason in the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
But the ozone layer was highly communicated, highly successful. Everything just kind of worked out, being repaired. So I don't understand why we suddenly departed from the direct measurements this time around.
Yeah, well, I think this is what there was political will to agree to, right? And I think the reason is that is very slippery. Yeah. Okay, so commitments, yeah, there aren't really meaningful commitments. Mutual trust, right? So I think there's a problem here that basically they're poor intermediate objectives. Like it's not really clear what countries are promising to do, and I think it's very poor language around this as well. So almost universally, the way that commitments are being reported are that we commit to reducing our CO2 output by X%. Like even that language, I would very strongly object to, right? Because that sort of says, well, if you have emitted a lot of carbon dioxide in the past, then you should be allowed to do it in the future as well, right? Because you're just making a relative statement, right? I think that's a bizarre allowance, but it's total, like the whole language is totally steeped in that kind of language. For timeframes, so the annexes where countries can commit to their nationally determined contributions. So these are contributions that countries commit to. But the problem is that the time frame for those are very long, right? So Britain committed in 2008 to being net zero in 2050, which is a 42-year horizon. It seems like an extraordinary thing to try to commit to. Okay, Britain has actually, there's a process of every 5 years or so, there's a new limit set. So it doesn't stand completely on its own, although that process it doesn't interact with the Paris process at all. So Britain's NDC is the latest one is from 2021. Boris Johnson said that we would reduce our CO2 by 68% by 2030. That's a long time in the future, and actually, we're not going to make that, right? And other countries know that we're not going to make it, right? We would have to lower our emissions by 7% per year from now to 2030. That's way higher than anything that we've ever done before. So I think the way that the framework works is that it actually undermines trust, right? It doesn't build trust between partners, it undermines trust, right? Because partners are saying, oh, we're going to do X, we're going to do Y, we're going to do Z. But actually, do we believe any of that about partners? No, we don't, right? Because it's blatantly obvious that, the necessary steps are not being taken, right? But again, the politicians sort of like that because it was cool to say that we're world leader, right? And then go home and do nothing. Right? And the framework allows you to do Okay, so, for transparency, well, it's sort of, my objections are sort of a bit similar, like for timeframes, you can't really tell, what's happening, in the process, and your partners can't tell. And therefore, you can't, the whole point of transparency is that you can verify that your partners are doing what they said they would do. Also, the framework, completely lacks, reciprocity, like you can't say that, I'll do this if you do it.
In terms of building mutual trust, like it seems like part of the difficulty is that we've had like a relatively small time frame over which to demonstrate the steps that we've taken, right? So we have commitments, but we don't have demonstrated decarbonization. I mean, obviously, we don't really have the time to demonstrate, and bypass in a very kind of trustworthy way.
Absolutely. And so that's going to be part of my proposal.
Yeah.
That we need to work on a much higher frequency. Like we can't. If we do something on a 10-year timescale from now on, then if it doesn't work, then that's really bad.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have to move. We have to think of things on a much. So I'll talk about an annual timescale, right? I totally agree. Okay, so bottom line here is the Paris Agreement doesn't do any of the things that would allow parties to cooperate, and we should really worry about that. Right? So the thing that upset me about the discussion that I took part in was that people were sort of saying, "Oh, it works a little bit too slowly, so maybe we just have to kind of push it a little bit, right?" I think no. I think it's fundamentally flawed. Right? It's not going to work, right? Even if you push it a little harder, right? And there's some good reasons, and we understand those reasons. Right? Okay. So let me see how I'm doing for time. I'm spending too much time. So I think of the residual amount of atmosphere of CO2 in the atmosphere as a resource. I like to use that language to think about how are we going to manage this thing, right? So think of the difference between the eventual limit of CO2. Let's say we do solve the problem at some point, so there'll be some maximum amount of CO2. I don't know what it is, and it also doesn't matter for my argument what that level is going to be. But the eventual limit of CO2, the difference between the eventual limit of CO2 and the amount of CO2 we have at the moment, think of that as being a resource, right? It's a resource that we can choose to exploit, or we can choose, who can exploit that resource, right? So it's a little bit weird resource because most resources have a geographic localization, right? And mostly the ownership of a resource depends on where it is. If it's in your ground, then it's yours. But this resource doesn't exist in that sense. In fact, it gets mixed for practical purposes almost instantaneously around the entire atmosphere. Right. Secondly, it's the absence of something which is a resource, but that is a little unusual, but it doesn't really matter for the argument. It's desirable. It exists in a limited quantity. Right. So that's sort of the cornerstones of what resources are. Now the question is, who owns the resource, right? And I don't mean that in a legal sense, but I'm going to mean that in a sort of ethical sense, right? Who should be able to benefit from this resource? But I can't see that it could deviate very much from the answer of sort of all of us in some sense. I find it very hard to say, well, I don't know, industrialized countries have more access to it, or people on the northern hemisphere, or I don't know. It seems bizarre, whatever other answer you try to come up with, right? So I'm gonna think of the case here that we think that this resource, from an ethical point of view, it belongs to all people on Earth.
And future.
And the future. Okay, so something that I haven't really talked about very much at the moment. I've sort of been presenting things from a static point of view, but of course, the problem is also if we don't do something now, that's a detriment to us, but it might be a positive for future generations, right? So of course, you would have to be willing to make that trade-off. I haven't explicitly said that, but if you're not willing to make that trade-off, then of course we can go home, right? Then there's nothing to be done. But presumably we are. Some of us have kids, you know, we worry extra about this problem, but absolutely. Okay, so we have this resource and we all own it. How is it being managed? Well, it's not being managed. I think it's just a free for all. You just take whatever you need, right? By putting CO2 up, right? So one way of phrasing this is saying we act as though the price of the resource was set to zero, right? Or economists would call this an unpriced externality. They're saying it's something that has value, but we're not going to take that value into account in the way that we act or we account for things. Okay, so I think the problem here is staring us right in the face, right? We're acting as though the price was zero. We should just set a non-zero price. The price should be higher than zero. And that's what the proposal is going to be. Is going to be. So I'm going to tell you now of a scheme that I've tried to think about that doesn't have these drawbacks. And you might think that this is probably impossible to do. I think it's actually not. I think it's quite possible to do. It'll be related to a lot of other things that you've probably heard of. Carbon pricing. These tax and rebate systems, etc. It's true. It's a particular variant of those things. Let me tell you what I think first, and I think the name is not very important here. The important thing is what is actually the substance of the idea. Okay. So I propose a climate club.
Yeah, click on the OK and then the bar will go. Sorry, thank you. Check.
So I frame it in terms of a climate club. So it's a club, and a club only exists on a yearly cycle, right? So it doesn't even exist beyond more than a year. And the club is a club which does four things every cycle of the year. Firstly, all countries are invited to join the club at a prefixed price, P euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. Right? So this number is going to govern how the club works, and there's only going to be one number, and it's the price of CO2 in euros per ton in this case. Okay, and the price will be published beforehand, right? So you know what you're getting yourself into. Okay, at the end of the year, so countries are initially asked whether they want to be a member, yes or no. At the end of the year, then each country has to report their fossil fuel production in CO2 equivalents. They have to report their greenhouse gas emissions, and then they pay their contributions, which is the production plus the emissions times the price. Okay, so they pay that into the club, and what the club does, it immediately redistributes all of the money according to the population of each of the countries. Okay, so just hand back the money according to the population of the membership countries. Then the last thing that the countries do is they vote on what should the price be next year. And after that, the club is dissolved, and then you start the cycle again. Okay, and I propose the vote to be an open ballot vote, so that everybody can see what each country thinks the price should be. A median vote, for example, one vote per country. Okay, so let's try and understand some of the consequences of what this club would look like. Okay, so first of all, the club is designed to coexist with other schemes. So you can still be part of the Paris Agreement. You can also still be part of the European trading system or the UK trading system or whatever you like. So it doesn't preclude anything else that you might do. So a nation's net contribution or payout will depend only on the per capita production or emission, right? Because of the way the proceeds are collected, depending on your CO2, your fossil fuel production and CO2 emissions, and the way the money is handed back out depends only on the population of the countries, right? So that means that a country that has the average production and emission of all the countries who are members will get their rebate will be the same size as what they put in, right? So they'll be neutral, right? And countries who use more fossil fuels, or emit more CO2 per capita will be net contributors to the club, and countries with lower emissions will be net beneficiaries. Okay, and that it reflects the fact that it's the people who own the resource, right? So it depends on whether you are a larger than average user, a user being defined in terms of production and emission, than average. Yes.
I mean, I'm sorry, I know we're running short on time. I'll just give you a thought experiment, maybe we can take it up there. Let's say it's a country which has the 6 countries. One country produces 5 units of production and no emissions. And then there's 5 neighbors which have 1 unit of consumption each, and therefore also emissions, but no production. So the one that produces 5 units is going to have to pay 5 out of 10, half, and all the others are going to be paying 1 out of 10 each.
Yeah.
But in fact, all of the production was used for emissions by somebody else, right?
Yeah. So I think
That seems to be somewhat not right, because the people who produce it, they just produced it, they didn't actually emit it. They just produced and gave it all away. So I know it's a thought experiment, it's pushing to an extreme, but this element of double counting going on here.
no, there's not an element of double counting. There are things that are bad for the environment, and you pay for those. Right? I don't think, like, you can say, well, this is double counting, but you could just lower the price to be half. Then it's single counting. Right?
Okay.
I think they're bad, they're things that you shouldn't be doing, and those should cost you. I've sort of said that there's a parity between emitting CO2 and producing fossil fuels,
Yeah.
and this is a choice that I made, right? I don't know whether it should be, 0.7, 0.3. Right.
Thank you, yeah, okay, but I want to think some more about it, I think there's some more questions there.
Thanks. I was wondering how the time perspective come into play here. So if I, again, thought experiment, no production, no emissions from now on, but I am in charge of huge amount of emissions in the past, how does it being taken into account here?
Okay, so my proposal doesn't address the past.
Okay.
And this is the weakness, this is something I haven't figured out what to do about yet.
Okay.
I'm only talking about what could we do now, right?
And
So,
then the second part
Yeah.
of it is, what is the incentive to do like big projects that will pay out for 30 years, 20 years, if I'm only measured on a yearly basis?
okay, but you're not actually only measured on a yearly basis, right? So the problem here is that changing infrastructure in a country takes a lot of time, right? It takes 10 years or 30 years, right? But you have to make bets about what's going to happen in the future, right? And if your country thinks that, this will continue to be a problem and it will continue to be valued, that you emit less, then you can make the bet that this can be amortized over time, right? The crucial thing here is that countries are never asked to commit to something which is not completely concrete, right? It's always open. They always know what the price is, what they're agreeing to, right? Of course, in the back of their heads, they would have to do exactly this sort of calculation, and it won't pay off to make a huge investment in 1 year, of course, right? But this is not a problem with the club. This is a problem with the world. Right? Yeah.
Going back to the Fisher example, let's say we have a country that produces a lot. What incentive do they have to join that club? If they're going to pay a lot and not get anything in return, they could just continue what they're doing and be fine. The other one paying and get the money, whatever, they just continue producing as they do.
Yeah, so we have to worry about that, but my next slide is why would big emitters join, right? So let's talk about that. There was a question.
I was wondering if you refer to active variables like production and emissions. What about passive variables such as like prevention of ecosystems to be destroyed, like rainforests? Should they also be part of the calculation?
Maybe. So what I really want to do is to invent a system which is as simple as possible, right? And if you try, when you try to make things more and more granular and include more and more different aspects, then you open yourself up to basically disagreement about, you know, is this exactly the right way to evaluate loss of biodiversity, and how does that compare to a ton of CO2? Well, if people have different opinions about this, then this is going to turn into a problem, right? So that was basically what shut down the Kyoto Protocol, was that people couldn't agree on what should be the limit, and who should be assigned what allowances, right?
Yeah.
So the thing I'm trying to set up here is something which I'm not saying it's ideal, but I'm saying it's pretty good compared to what we have, right? And there are no questions. There are no one of the highlights here is there's no room for any negotiation, right? Every country just asks, are you joining this year? Yes or no? Right? You can't argue about anything. Of course, you can influence the price. If you're a member, you can influence the price, right? And of course, that's going to be an interesting thing. Like low emission countries would like the price to be high, right? But if they vote the price up to be too high, then maybe they will dissuade higher emission countries to join. So they probably can't go overboard on that, and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
I think it would be pretty interesting if a club like this existed to think about what would different countries. I don't know what Britain would do. Would Britain become a member of this? So Britain, we have a CO2 emission of 5 tons per person per year, which is more or less equal to the global average. So if all countries were members, this is not taking into account production, but then we would be a neutral partner. But there are probably some countries that won't participate, at least immediately. Yeah.
Why have you included population?
Well, because I think that's a natural way of measuring things. Like, so there's a lot of things in the media that say that, well, China is the biggest emitter, right? Well, China is also the biggest country.
But
Right. Like the US is twice as big emitter per person than China is, right? So why is China as the biggest emitter? That seems to me to be, that would suggest that you could solve the problem by cutting China in two.
But this link between population and that, is there any evidence for that, or is it consumption?
I don't know what you mean by evidence. Like, I'm just saying the allowance should be per person because of the people who own the resource.
But you seem to be making a link between population and CO2, so the more people, the more CO2, that seems to be what you're saying.
Well, that would be self-evidently obvious.
Isn't it?
Well, you're tying it to consumption, right? So that if you're in a rich country, you'll produce.
Yeah, I'm saying it's not population, it's consumption of people, rather than how many people. What's the behavior of the people, not how many
If you
people.
have like a country with lots of population, but let's say clean energy, then it'll be consume a lot. But if you have like a country with a lot of people, but consuming like a lot of carbon, it's not big country means.
So it's obviously it's the product of the two that is what really makes an impact on the atmosphere, right? But what should the allowance of a country be? Well, surely that must depend on how big the country is. Should Netherlands have the same allowance as China because they're both a country?
But
That would seem bizarre.
for the consumption of CO2 per person in Netherlands is different than the one in China.
But what should the allowance be? What would be the natural? What would be the equilibrium? Something.
So
What would be reasonable?
I think there's I don't know, maybe incorrect, but I think there's actually just a slight misunderstanding.
in my mind, in the way you describe the population, that's actually, it's effectively an output. It's the provision per person across the entire world is equal because it's one per person, per, you know, 1 unit per person. Whereas you're thinking of it as an allowance for consumption, which I don't think is the right way to think about it. Because the population within a given country of consumers is not otherwise you end up with this ridiculous disparities between people in a given country having relative to the rate of the country's total consumption, and that's not the way to think about it. So I think of the population as on the other side of the equation, where it's the allowance that the world receives simply the amount of CO2 that you consumed, and it's divided by the population of the world. Here's your allocation per country, which is effectively proportional to the population of the country. And
So let me just try to wrap up the next slide or two, and then we can. I'm happy to hang out for a little while and have some discussion afterwards. Okay, so the main thing, I guess, is that the club immediately creates a strong economic pressure to reduce production and emission, right? And that holds both of the countries that are above average, but it also holds for countries that are below average. If they can get even further below average, then their rebate would be even bigger, right? So strong economic incentives for everybody. One last point which I think is quite important is that you should be able to join conditionally, right? So you should say, well, I'm willing to join the club. Britain is willing to join the club if France and Germany also join. Okay, and I think that should be allowed. And I think that would allow this reciprocity principle to prevail. Okay, skip this slide. That's fine. Okay. So what would the dynamics of this thing? If this thing was set up, then what would happen? Right. So nations in the global south, they typically have much lower per capita production and emission, and they would benefit immediately, right? Because they would be well, initially there aren't any members, I guess, but they would be very close to the lower limit, and they would have a smaller. They would be very likely to be net beneficiaries of the system, right? So the least emitting country in the world per capita couldn't lose anything by joining, right? So they would join, and then the next one could join, right? Now the question is, how do you get big emitters to join, right? So I've had some thoughts about that. So first of all, you might think that this is a sound and fair and effective mechanism of how to manage this resource. And you might want to join the club because it is actually it implements a fair mechanism, right? It's based on equitable and ethical principle that the atmosphere belongs to everyone, right? So it's something that one could subscribe to, and I think a lot of people probably would subscribe to a principle like this. And you could sort of say, no, I don't believe in this. I believe that some countries should have more of the resource than other countries. And I think if people had that attitude, I don't have anything particularly against that, but I think you should say it out loud if that's the case. I don't think there are a lot of persuasive alternatives to how to do this, and I think the transparent annual cycle might put a lot of pressure on non-members. Right? Every year, every country would have to say, no, we still don't want to be a member of this thing. Right? We won't contribute. There is a way to contribute to this thing. I think it would be very powerful, just the mere existence of this thing. Right? That people would have to, as I said, I don't know what would happen in Britain if this thing was actually something that you could join or you could decide not to. Once a nation has joined, it's in their advantage to get other higher per capita emitters to join as well, right? So it's so once you're in the club, it's in your interest to get other countries to join as well. Okay, and the last thing is, I think a club like this could actually be successful even if you didn't have universal membership. I think if you had something like 50% membership, then I think the actual outcomes of what the club was doing would be big enough that countries would say, well, we will accept the cost of being of being members. Okay, it ignores historical different emissions. Somebody pulled me up for that already. Let me just finish this slide and I'll come to your question. Okay, so I think it's difficult to know whether we're going to be able to rise to this to this challenge or not. Well, I think it's very important that I try to argue that what we have at the moment is really very, very poor. Right? I think we can do way better than that. And I think it's a shame that people are not really upfront about it. So when I think addressing it, this is the real problem. It's the problem that we're pretending that something doesn't have value, but we could just make it have a value, right? And this is the one way of trying to do it. So hopefully I persuade you that it's simple, equitable, it's transparent, like everything is open. The price is open. Who voted for which price is open. Everybody can scrutinize everything. You can build trust because you're doing this on a yearly cycle. You can verify that your partners did what they said they would do and they paid up last year, right? So because it worked on the yearly cycle, this will be able to build trust, and it can start immediately. Okay, my starting price was €0, so it wouldn't actually do anything in the first year. So hopefully, you'll get more members that way, but it would take effect in a year's time. All right, thank you. So there.
I'm going to make a quick something. I know that some people may want to leave, and also there's some comments online. They're not able to get their voice in. So if we can, so anybody wants to leave now, please feel free to do so, including online. And then I'd like the people online make comments, and then we have the room until 3. So we can stay here for a long time. But I'll stop the recording of that. So anybody online who wants to come on and make a comment, please unmute and you can have your say before it's the recording.
Okay.
Go on.
Yeah, I think this is all too collegiate and nice, and it's all about clubs, and it's too late for that. And basically, the model we need to have is more like warfare and colonization. So dealing with the past is about reparations for colonizing areas, and it's typically the worst polluters historically that are historically bad, and that's a model that has worked. But the other thing is war reparations, and the richer countries could win a war, but they could insist that people that in the future are going to be, we want to do this discounting for the future, and they could just say, fine, we're just going to take the money from a trade agreement. And if China doesn't want to trade with Europe, it can just go and figure out who it's going to trade with. But we've just taxed that trade and put that money into carbon capture or whatever. And I think this whole thing about having some club where there's some kind of nice incentive matching thing is just very nice in an academic way, but it's historically rarely worked, and it doesn't deal with the proper modeling the imbalances of power, which are not rational. So I think the models have to be taken from things that are much more extreme, unfortunately. But that's just my view, and I might be wrong too.
Thanks, John. I guess there wasn't much of a question there. I sort of agree with you, but I think it would still be interesting if a club like this existed to see what the consequences of it would be. I hesitate to predict that it would be immensely popular, with a big enough fraction to really make a difference. I don't know. I don't know, but the alternatives are also troublesome in various ways.
Thank you. Any other online?
If could I just follow up, John?
Yeah.
It's just that if you look at this from an internet style, then this proposal is scale invariant, because you could break it down into lots of smaller clubs with smaller populations, and so you can imagine having a bunch of nested local clubs that are all doing their own things, and then nesting it together to make it a bigger thing. So, for example, we could have all the Cambridge colleges just getting together to decide to. I'm totally serious, right? They're good for each other, and then add it all up. But the biggest problem is we don't have a common currency for this, because using money, I think, is really bad. But using just ppm as the actual emissions as the actual thing you're trying to account for, this would just work, right? Without any complexities of exchange rates and all that kind of stuff. So, like, there is something in saying that you could build lots of small composable clubs that can incorporate together, which is basically how the internet succeeded as a massive international social enterprise. So I think that's compatible with Carl's proposal.
The commodity value of joining the internet was an external in comparison to the value, in contrast to the value here. I still can't understand the incentive for a large producer consumer with an enormous population or with a small population being interested. I wish it was the case, but I just can't see the incentive structure.
So at the moment, so I think, you know, it does boil down to an ethical question, right? Is it, will I be willing to give up on certain things to participate in this thing? That's the question, right? But I think at the moment, a lot of countries are getting away with effectively saying no to that question without even ever addressing it. Right? And I think it'd be very helpful if you have to stand up every year and say, no way, I'm not participating.
I'm curious about, you briefly said, like, I think it would be effective if only 50% of countries join. Do you mean 50% of countries or 50% of emissions? Countries covering 50% of emissions.
Ah, okay, I guess I'm thinking of emissions. 50% of countries could correspond to a very small fraction of the emissions. And like, so the question is, when will you join a scheme like this? When you think that the benefits of the scheme will out what it's costing you, right? And the benefit is, of course, to prevent climate change from happening or slowing down climate change happening, right? So it would have to be big enough amount of CO2 that wasn't released for you to be able to accept, you know, the cost to your citizen. And I think that has to be a, you know, 50% is kind of it's just a pluck out of the air, right? I don't think it has to be 95%. Right, I think it could work with a much lower percentage than that, right? But 10%, nah, that's probably not. That's not really making a difference.
Can you go to your mechanism slide again? You said after the lowest per capita emission country, they always would want to join. But then
the dynamics, yeah.
Then
This one.
does the one with the number? Does the second best country have an incentive to join, or if the best country is there, will the second best country just wind up being the best country if it winds up being just two of them?
If there were only two of them, yeah, then of course it's the average consumption of the members that is relevant.
Yeah,
right? And then the second country would be the baddie in that.
So even if you're really good, if you can't get somebody worse than you to join, you are committed to paying.
Yes, I think there's a twist to that might be helpful. Sorry to jump in, but I mean, if you take credit for your clean energy investments or your emission reductions capital upfront costs. So let's say it's production plus emission minus capital investment in anything that reduces for the future, right? Then you have an incentive to say, look, I'm putting money into investment in my country to draw down carbon dioxide or to do whatever it is going to reduce in future emissions later on. And that might convince politicians that this is like a clean energy credit or clean, whatever, reducing energy credit, that sets the incentive structure for somebody who's a high emitter. So let's take Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a huge producer, not a big emitter in terms of overall emissions, right? But a huge producer. If they say to Saudi, look, your commodity is going away. But if you take the profits you have right now and you invest that into solar or whatever, wind, I don't know, whatever it is, and I'm going to give you all of that back in terms of the credit. So you don't have to pay a big price now. So that price you're paying will be in the form of an investment in your country's infrastructure. That might turn the tables for big profit-making countries today, the oil-producing countries, to have an incentive to invest that.
Yeah, so I think that you can accelerate the incentive, but there should be already an incentive saying, well, if you can pay a lower fee over the coming years, then that should already be an incentive, right? Again, I hesitate a little bit to think, you know, there's a devil in the detail of saying, well, what should you invest in? And, you know, what is allowed and what's not allowed.
That's fair, that's why they have negotiating teams. That's a bit, that's to know if you're.
I think it was somewhat addressed actually, but yeah, it's just, I guess, the statement you made on the next slide that the lowest emitters to join is essentially only if they assume that sufficient higher per capita emission countries are joining, right? That goes without saying. So, yeah.
Well, in fact, it's sort of a weird incentive to like short the system. Like you want to join with someone else who thinks you're going to emit a lot, but you actually and they thought you would. So what you want to do is like I know you said no, like I'm Qatar and I'm gonna join and then I'm going to not produce any oil this year. Counter to everyone's expectation. Right? Then you like basically shorted it. You don't need to join again next year. But you make a huge amount of money off of it.
Yeah, I think that should be perfectly legal.
Yeah,
Like, you didn't produce oil.
Yeah.
I think it's good. Like a lot of people ask me, how can you game the system? I think it's a very difficult system to game.
But then you just don't join next year and you produce twice as much oil.
Yeah, okay, so if you, well, I think practically you probably couldn't really do that because oil production systems
Sure, like.
don't really work that way. So I think in practice, yeah. But I think there's another problem which I haven't really, which I didn't really get into, which is I think if you don't join the first year, then if you want to join the second year, then I think you have to pay your dues for the first year. Right, because otherwise, there'll be an incentive to wait. Right. And so I think it would have to be that if you want to join later, then you've got to pay all the way back to the start.
Yeah, but
Then you're not joining at all.
No, then you have to join immediately, right?
So the reason
Then
the protocol worked so well is it started with incremental sort of informal discussions. But one of the main incentives to join it was the trade negotiations they had. So yes, it banned certain safe chemicals, but the main incentive to join was that they had trade partners. So if you were in this club, if you part of the protocol, you got better trade deals. So it brought in these bigger countries, and then everyone else started to join, and that's why it worked so well.
Well, I think if there was a club like this and some countries were members, then I think it would be quite natural that country would say, well, you know, if we trade with you, you know, there'll be tariffs or something because you're not a member, right? You're not underlying the system, and so I think that would be a natural consequence, right? It would be an uneven playing field, right? And you know, people wouldn't accept that. So we'd say, okay, US is not a member, so we'll not allow you to trade on the same terms.
Okay, so I'm just going to break. I'm going to stop the recording now, and again,